The mess hall pulsed with noise, the kind that filled every corner until silence seemed like an impossible memory. Forks clanged against metal trays, boots scuffed across the tile, voices rose in bursts of laughter that cracked through the air like rifle fire. The smell of overcooked vegetables mixed with grease and coffee, heavy and sour, yet oddly comforting to those who lived inside these walls. Long tables stretched in neat lines, soldiers pressed shoulder to shoulder, the steady churn of routine holding the place together. At the far end of one bench, just where the light from the high windows dimmed into shadow, a woman sat alone. She wasn't in uniform. She wasn't supposed to belong here, not by the look of her. Her clothes were plain, threadbare, more suited to a farmer's market than a military base. The jacket she wore sagged at the shoulders, the cuffs rubbed thin from years of work. Her hair, streaked silver, was drawn back simply, without care for style. Her hands, veined and roughened by time, cupped around a tin mug, as though it were a small fire she meant to keep alive. On her tray sat only bread, a slice of boiled potato, and a few wilted greens she seemed in no hurry to finish. She kept her eyes on her food, chewing slowly, quietly, as if the clamor around her belonged to another world, but it didn't take long for that quiet to become a target. 5 recruits, not long in their uniforms, spotted her at once. Young, restless, still too proud of the shine on their boots and the patches on their sleeves, they leaned toward each other, grins spreading like cracks in glass. The first one snorted loud enough to carry. "What's this? We let civilians in now?" His voice drew the attention of the others, and soon they were circling her with words instead of steps. "Looks like she wandered in from a farmyard. Check her plate must have raided the trash. Careful, don't sit too close. Might catch whatever she's got." Their laughter came sharp, jagged, meant to wound. They nudged each other, daring someone to say more, to push further. One of them bent his voice into a falsetto, mimicking, "Excuse me, ma'am, did you take a wrong turn on the way to the soup kitchen?" The rest erupted, trays rattling against the table as their bodies shook with cruel amusement. She didn't look up, not once. Her fingers tightened slightly around the hem of her jacket, the only movement she allowed herself. She tore a piece of bread, dipped it into the thin broth, and chewed with the same calm rhythm as before. Her silence made the recruits bolder, louder, filling the air with the kind of mockery that didn't just bounce off walls but seeped into the bones of those forced to hear it. Yet, not everyone laughed. Across the tables, soldiers paused mid-bite, forks hanging in the air. A sergeant's eyes flicked toward her and then quickly away, as though seeing something he couldn't quite face. A corporal shifted uncomfortably, his jaw tight, his appetite gone. The recruits didn't notice. They were too busy proving themselves to one another, too blind to the weight in the room that seemed to thicken with every word. Something about the woman unsettled them, though they couldn't name it. She sat too still, too certain, like stone carved into the shape of someone ordinary. The edges of her jacket were frayed, but the way she wore it was not poverty, it was possession. She didn't flinch, didn't rush, didn't leave. And as their voices carried sharper and sharper across the hall, the others listening felt a strange current under the noise, as if the mockery was not cutting her down, but cutting something loose they didn't yet understand. The woman remained in her quiet, eating as though no one else existed. But her stillness was not weakness. It was gravity. And before long, it would pull the whole room toward her. The laughter had stretched too far, spilling into the spaces where even cruelty begins to feel uneasy. The woman never raised her eyes, never broke the rhythm of her quiet meal, and that silence unsettled them more than any protest might have. One of the recruits, lanky and eager to prove he could outdo the rest, leaned forward until his boot nearly touched the hem of her jacket. His smirk grew when he spotted the bag slouched at her feet. It was nothing impressive at first glance: faded canvas, seams long past their prime, straps worn thin as though it had been dragged through years rather than carried. But stitched into one side, barely clinging to the fabric, was a patch. "Look at this," the recruit sneered, nudging the bag with the edge of his boot so the others could see. Even her junks got junk on it. Some dead club logo or something. His finger jabbed at the patch and the others leaned closer, laughing at the frayed edges, the washed-out colors that once must have been bold. To them it was nothing, less than nothing, a scrap, a relic without meaning. But not to everyone. At the next table over, a sergeant with close-cropped hair and the posture of a man who had spent half his life under weight, heavier than armor, happened to glance down. His eyes locked on the patch, and his body betrayed him before his mind caught up. His fork slipped from his hand, clattering against his tray with a metallic crack that seemed to echo far louder than it should have. The sound cut across the laughter. Heads turned, the recruits blinked, confused. The sergeant's face had gone pale, his jaw tight, his eyes pinned to the emblem as though it were alive. Around him, others followed his gaze, confusion shifting into unease. Whispers stirred at the edges of the hall, subtle at first, then stronger, questions murmured between soldiers who recognized more than they wished to admit. The recruits still didn't notice. They puffed themselves up, circling the moment like vultures. One laughed and said, "Bet she stitched that on herself, trying to look important." Another snorted, "Yeah, looks like something from a flea market. Probably fake anyway." Their words faltered, though, as the air in the room changed. It was heavier now, pressing in from all sides. The sergeant stood abruptly. His chair scraped back with a violent screech, and the hall hushed in its wake. His voice, when it came, was sharp, cutting, but not with anger. It carried something different, something that made the recruits stiffen before they even understood why. "Where did you get that?" he asked. Not to the recruits, but to the woman. The words hit the room like a strike of lightning. Every soldier nearby froze. The recruits blinked, glanced at each other, baffled. "What, sir?" One stammered, still trying to laugh, though the sound cracked thin in his throat. "That patch." The sergeant's voice was louder now, steadier, and threaded with a reverence that stripped all mockery from the air. He pointed at the emblem, as if naming it aloud would summon ghosts. "Where did you get that?" The woman finally raised her head. Slowly, deliberately, as though she had been waiting for the question her entire life. Her eyes, worn with years yet piercing, met the sergeant's across the space. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The silence itself was enough to shake the hall. The recruits, who only moments ago had laughed the loudest, suddenly felt the floor tilt beneath them. Something they had mocked as meaningless was pulling the entire room into a gravity they couldn't escape. And for the first time since their laughter began, they wished desperately to take it back. The mess hall was still, the kind of stillness that settles when every breath feels like it might shatter the air. The woman's hands rested lightly on the table, fingers curled as if holding back years of memory. Slowly, she lifted her gaze, and for the first time, the recruits who had mocked her found themselves caught in eyes that did not waver. They were not loud, not bright, not fierce like fire. They were steady, weathered, the color of stone smoothed by storms, eyes that had seen too much and refused to look away. Her voice, when it came, was quiet, yet quiet in a way that carried, soft but heavy, like a single drop of water striking the bottom of a well. Every word landed with weight. "That patch," she began, her hand brushing the frayed emblem at her feet, "was not bought. It was earned." The recruits shifted uneasily, their smirks gone, their postures crumbling into something smaller, tighter. "It belonged to a unit that does not exist on paper," she continued, her gaze never leaving the sergeant who had spoken first. "A unit erased by design. We were called OSR Operation Silent Raptor. There are no plaques, no citations, no photographs hanging on walls. Only fragments like this." Her fingers pressed against the torn patch, the faded outline of a falcon mid-dive clutching lightning in its talons. The room seemed to lean closer, pulled toward her words. Forks lay forgotten, trays cooling in front of men and women who suddenly felt like children in the presence of something vast. The recruits who had begun the mockery sat frozen, shame pooling in their faces, the red creeping up their necks. One opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it quickly, swallowing against the silence pressing in on him. We went where others could not, the woman said softly. Missions that never reached newspapers. Villages no map cared to mark. We carried no names, only ciphers. If we succeeded, the world moved forward, and never knew why. If we failed, we vanished, and no one asked where we went. She paused, and the silence grew heavier still. We did not fight for medals. We fought so that others would never need to know the fight existed at all. Her voice broke just slightly on the next word, but she pressed on. Men I trained with, men I laughed with, men I buried with my own hands, they are not remembered. They were erased. For national security, they told me, for the greater good, their sacrifices were sealed in silence. One of the recruits, his earlier bravado gone, stared down at the table as though the grain of the wood could swallow him whole. Another rubbed the back of his neck, cheeks flushed, unable to meet her eyes. She leaned back, her hand folding gently in her lap once more. That patch is the only proof left. Proof that we were not ghosts, though history made us so. Proof that blood was spilled quietly, so the rest of the world could laugh loudly. Her eyes flicked briefly toward the 5 who had mocked her. You think it is nothing, but it is everything. The mess hall had gone so quiet that the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead felt deafening. The woman's words lingered, settling like dust into the cracks of the room, impossible to sweep away. The recruits who had once filled the air with laughter now sat with the weight of their own ignorance pressing hard against their chests. Shame was not loud, it was silent, and in that silence, they burned. And still she sat, calm, unshaken, as if carrying truth was something she had long since learned to do alone. The hall remained hushed, every soldier present knowing that a scar, hidden for decades, had just been laid bare in front of them. A scar in the shape of an old emblem that the world had chosen to forget until now. The weight of her words still hung in the air, heavier than the scent of grease and coffee, heavier than the echoes of laughter that had long since died in every throat. For a long moment no one moved, the hall caught in a stillness so complete it seemed the walls themselves were holding their breath. Then the sergeant straightened. His boots clicked together, his back locked into rigid lines, and in one sharp motion he raised his hand to his brow. The salute cracked through the silence louder than a gunshot. Every eye turned. For a heartbeat, the recruits stared, unsure, still caught between disbelief and shame. But soldiers know instinct, and instinct carried the room. Chairs scraped back, trays were shoved aside, and one by one they stood, rising like a tide until the entire mess hall was on its feet. Forks were abandoned mid-bite, conversations left unfinished, the rhythm of daily routine forgotten. What remained was a hall of men and women, young and seasoned, saluting not to rank, not to order, but to something older and heavier recognition of a ghost who had just stepped back into the living. The 5 recruits who had mocked her remained standing, too, but their posture was different. Their heads lowered, shoulders hunched, shame written plain across their faces. The bravado that had filled them minutes earlier was gone, stripped away and replaced by something raw. They had seen themselves reflected in her silence, and what stared back was nothing they could be proud of. One of them clenched his jaw as if swallowing words he wanted desperately to take back. Another kept his eyes shut, unwilling to meet hers, unwilling to meet anyone's. The woman did not return their stares. She remained seated, her hands folded neatly on the table, her eyes lowered now as if to ease the weight pressing against the young men who had not yet learned what reverence cost. She did not ask for their respect, and perhaps that was why it came so completely. The sergeant's salute held steady until he finally lowered his hand and stepped back, his throat working as though swallowing words that would never come. No one in the hall spoke. The silence itself was the honor, the kind no medal could replicate, the kind no record book could capture. Days passed, but the weight of that moment did not lift. Later that week, Soldiers filing into the mess hall stopped at the entryway, drawn by something new mounted to the wall. A framed photograph, edges worn but face unmistakable, stared back from behind glass. It was her, younger, sharper, eyes lit with the fire of years not yet lived. Beneath the photo, a plaque had been placed. Elise Rowan Operation Silent Raptor. Service without recognition. Valor beyond record. Some paused long enough to read the words twice. Some touched the glass lightly before moving on, as though reminding themselves the figure in the photo was real, no longer rumor, no longer ghost. And then Saturday came. She returned as she always did, stepping quietly through the doors, jacket slung across her shoulders, bag hanging by her side. But this time, no laughter met her. No whispers of dismissal. The room rose to its feet as one, trays pushed aside, soldiers standing shoulder to shoulder in silence. Their faces were solemn, their eyes steady, their respect unspoken but undeniable. Even the five who had once mocked her stood tall at the center, heads bowed in apology that needed no words. She paused in the doorway, her hand resting lightly on the strap of her bag. Her gaze drifted to the wall where her younger self now lived in a frame. She studied it for a moment, her lips curving into the faintest of smiles. Not pride, not vindication, but something quieter. Recognition at last, not for herself alone, but for all the voices buried beside her in silence. She walked forward, and the hall remained standing. Some heroes carry medals, some carry scars, and some carry only a faded patch on an old bag, the world forgetting, until one moment forces it to remember. That day, respect was not shouted, not commanded, it was paid in silence, and it was enough.